Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
When Madison left the Constitutional Convention, after it adjourned on September 17, 1787, he was militantly opposed to the idea of having any amendments to the Constitution. His whole strategy for ratifying the Constitution rested on the idea that what you wanted to have happen was to allow the people, speaking through the state ratification conventions, to vote the Constitution up or down, but not to have any kind of conditional amendments to it. Not to, for example, you couldn't say, we will ratify if changes A, B, and C take place. So we'll agree to ratify the Constitution only if other qualifications, other considerations are reached. So Madison was militantly opposed to that. And so he also worried, there was a big movement was afoot. It was supported by his friend, Governor Edmund Randolph, who was one of the 3 delegates who refused to sign the Constitution, to have a second convention, to let the Constitution be debated, try to discover what changes people thought should be made, and then have the convention reassemble and go through those proposed changes. Madison thought that would be a disaster, I think for very good reasons. When the delegates had shown up in Philadelphia in May 1787, they really had very few instructions to guide them. The Delaware delegates did, but Delaware is a small place, who cares? It wasn't that big a deal. If you had a second convention and the delegations came back, from their constituencies, they may come with all kinds of instructions that would make a later agreement very difficult. So Madison was militantly opposed, I think for pretty good reasons, to the idea of allowing the amendment process to go too far too fast. He really worried that the states might propose structural changes in what the framers had done. So he wasn't a big fan of amendments at all. So a couple of things happened, though, particularly during 1788, as the Constitution is being debated and acted upon by more and more states. One is, a movement does grow, in which the Federalists agreed to get the Constitution adopted by original states, let's say by the states originally starting with Massachusetts, to have it ratified, but then to propose amendments for the consideration of, probably the first Federal Congress that would meet once the Constitution was ratified. And that movement did gather enough steam. It was certainly important in Virginia, his own state, where Madison served as one of the Federalist leaders. Virginia was very closely divided. It's really kind of an 8 to 10 vote margin between the two sides, and no one was sure which way the convention was going to go. So Madison somewhat begrudgingly agreed to support the same procedure. We'll ratify the Constitution, but we will propose what turned out to be a fairly extensive list of amendments. Then what happened, well, a couple of things happened. One is, so Madison starts thinking, well, what should those amendments be? And then secondly, he gets involved in a very close race against his friend, but at this point his political rival, James Monroe, to represent their district in kind of south central Virginia, around Orange County and Culpeper County, Virginia. And so Madison, as part of his campaign, and it was a campaign in a kind of quasi-modern sense of the term, issues public letters agreeing to support amendments to the Constitution once Congress meets in the spring of 1789. And then what happens, I think, is quite curious. So Madison's on public record as saying he is behind the cause of amendments. So a couple things happen. One is Madison decides the only kinds of amendments that are acceptable are those that will take the form of what we eventually call a Bill of Rights. Actually, Madison didn't want to have a separate Bill of Rights. He wanted to have the articles he wanted inserted right in the text of the Constitution at the point where they would seem most relevant. So there's that concern. So Madison says, some amendments are necessary. We don't want to change anything in the real structure of the government, but we do want to, adopt amendments that will, reflect people's concerns with the absence of a Bill of Rights. I think Madison's other concern here is kind of more deeply political in nature. Madison did not really think a Bill of Rights was necessary on the merits. He didn't think it would do much good. He didn't really think the national government needed to be protected against the kinds of dangers that people worried about. He actually thought the biggest danger to rights would continue to come not from the national government, but from the states. But he did think that the whole process of getting the Constitution adopted would benefit if you could kind of assuage or kind of accommodate well-meaning, if somewhat misguided anti-federalists who did happen to think that some set of amendments were necessary. And that was really, and so in other words, there's a body of public opinion out there. It might be, it's still somewhat suspicious about what's been done. It has some anxieties about the character of the Constitution. So if you give this to them, if you do adopt some amendments, you'll help to accommodate them to the Constitution. So that's a very political decision. It wasn't that Madison felt the Bill of Rights would give you a strong basis for legal action. Though it is interesting to note that when he frames the individual articles, he does make significant changes. For example, bills of rights as they've been approved by Americans, going back to the mid-1770s, typically use the verb ought. Meant you were adopting general principles that you hope people would abide by. Madison liked the verb shall. Madison kind of turned the idea of what goes into a Bill of Rights from being a general statement of principles that's really addressed to everyone, perhaps not to anyone. He wanted to actually turn it into a set of legal commands that might be legally enforceable. So he was somewhat ambivalent at best about the real value of having a Bill of Rights, but if you're going to have one, you want to make it the best one possible. And he started to think, I think, in pretty critical ways about what would enhance the very quality of the articles he was adopting, or that he was proposing Congress eventually adopted.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.